Have you ever paused to consider the lives of communities who are always on the move? Always, constantly shifting across vast landscapes with their herds.
hmm
These are people whose unique way of life, really integral to our history, is often just overlooked in the standard textbooks.
That's very true.
So today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the fascinating world of nomadic pastoralists. We want to uncover their intricate lives and the profound transformations they've experienced, especially under colonial rule. Welcome, competitive exam aspirants, to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, pretty clear: to meticulously extract the core insights about the lifestyle, the historical context, and the remarkable adaptation of nomadic pastoralists to the challenges of the modern world.
Right.
This understanding isn't just interesting, it's absolutely crucial for anyone preparing for examinations like the UPSC, SSC, and various state PSCs where, socioeconomic history and diverse livelihood patterns are frequently tested. We're here to provide you with that edge.
Precisely. And to give you a crisp overview, nomadic pastoralism is essentially a livelihood system. It's fundamentally based on moving with herds of animals for sustenance. It's a way of life that, despite its historical significance and, well, widespread practice, has often been quite neglected in traditional academic studies. These tend to focus heavily on settled agriculture and industrial development, you see. So in this deep dive, our primary focus will be on the experiences of these communities in India and also in Africa. We'll reveal how dramatically their lives were impacted by the advent of colonialism and the subsequent pressures of modern society. And for you aspirants, understanding these often ignored communities provides a vital, holistic grasp of both Indian and world history. It significantly adds depth to your analytical capabilities for tackling those complex questions in your exams.
Excellent. So let's start at the beginning. How do we define this nomadic pastoralism, especially within the Indian context?
Right, let's begin by clearly defining what we mean by nomadic pastoralism, particularly in the rich and diverse Indian context. Unlike people who live in one fixed place, like, say, settled agriculturalists, nomadic pastoralists are communities who consistently move. They shift from one area to another throughout the year to earn their living. Their entire existence, their very survival, it revolves around their livestock. You'll commonly find them herding animals like goats, sheep, camels, or cattle. This is a lifestyle deeply rooted in age-old traditional systems. Yet, as we mentioned, it's often absent from standard textbooks. This actually makes it a particularly valuable area for your competitive exams, as understanding their unique adaptations to diverse terrains offers a crucial historical perspective.
That's a great foundational point. So what's the first major group or region we should explore to understand these fascinating movements? Where do we start?
Absolutely. Let's first look at the incredible adaptations found among pastoralists in the Indian mountains. We should particularly focus on their seasonal rhythms. Take the Gujjar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir, for instance. They are renowned as great herders, primarily of goats and sheep.
Okay.
Interestingly, many of them migrated to this region relatively recently in the 19th century, specifically searching for better pastures for their animals. Over the decades, they gradually established a remarkable and highly sophisticated annual cycle. In winter, you see, when the high mountains are completely covered in snow, this includes those vast natural pastures known as Bakarwals, which are basically alpine meadows above 12,000 feet.
Right, inaccessible then.
Exactly, dormant and inaccessible. So the Gujjar Bakarwals descend with their herds to the low hills of the Siwalik range. Here, the dry scrub forests provide essential pasture for their animals during winter. But as soon as April approaches, they begin their arduous northern march. Now, this isn't a solitary journey. Several households typically come together, forming what they call a kafila. Yes, a collective moving unit. Imagine dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people and animals moving together. It ensures mutual support and safety on these long journeys. They cross the challenging Peacer's Way, Pir Bunjal passes, and eventually enter the lush, verdant valley of Kashmir. With the full onset of summer, the snow melts, and these mountainsides just burst into vibrant green. This offers incredibly rich and nutritious forage for their animal herds. Then, by the end of September, the Bakarwals are on the move again, this time undertaking their downward journey, returning to their winter base in the low hills before the heavy snows begin to fall again in the high mountains. This meticulous timing is absolutely crucial. It's vital for their survival and the health of their herds, highlighting their deep, deep understanding of the environment.
That's an incredibly precise movement, almost like it's choreographed. So their entire annual calendar is dictated by the availability of pasture and the changing seasons, right? That's a core logic.
Exactly, that's the core logic. And it's a pattern we see replicated, but with remarkable local variations across the Himalayas. For example, in a different part, the Gaddi shepherds of Himachal Pradesh follow a remarkably similar cycle of seasonal movement. Their winters are also spent down in the low hills of the Siwalik range, where their flocks graze in the scrub forests. By April, they too head north, spending their summers in the regions of Lahore and Spiti. Once the snow melts and the high mountain passes are clear, many even move further up to higher mountain meadows, or dars as they call them.
Hours, okay.
Their return journey begins around September, and on their way down, they often make these strategic halts in the villages of Lahore and Spiti. This pause is quite clever. It allows them to reap their summer harvest and even sow their winter crop before continuing their descent with their flocks back to their winter grazing grounds on the Siwalik Hills. And an interesting activity during their descent from these high meadows is the shearing of their sheep. They're first bathed and cleaned before the wool is cut. It's all part of the cycle.
Fascinating. And you mentioned other groups too.
Yes. Further to the east, in Garhwal and Kumaon, we find the Gujjar cattle herders. Now, their movement is slightly distinct. They descend to the dry forests of the Pabar, that's a dry forested area below the foothills during the winter. Then, in summer, they ascend to the high meadows, the Bakarwals. Many of these Gujjar herders were originally from Jammu, having migrated to the UP hills, as it was then, in the 19th century, again, in search of good pastures. This pattern, the cyclical movement between summer and winter pastures is, in fact, typical of many pastoral communities across the Himalayas. You have the Bhutias, the Sherpas, the Kanaris, all of them have had to adapt intrinsically to seasonal changes, making highly effective and, importantly, sustainable use of available pastures in different places.
So if I'm hearing this right, their constant movement wasn't just like a tradition passed down. It was actually a sophisticated form of environmental protection and resource management.
Exactly. That's a crucial insight right there. Nomadic pastoralism is, at its heart, a remarkably sustainable and ecologically intelligent system of land management, especially for fragile ecosystems like mountains or drylands. It ensured the land could breathe and recover, preventing the very overgrazing that, ironically, colonial policies later forced upon them. This continuous movement was not merely tradition, it was an ingenious and crucial practice for their survival and for the environment.
How so, specifically?
Well, when the pasture in one place was exhausted or perhaps became unusable due to weather, they would simply move their herds and flocks to new areas. This regular relocation allowed the pastures time to recover naturally. It prevented overuse and ensured the long-term sustainability of the grazing lands. It's a classic example of sustainable resource management, really, one that ensured the land could be used effectively for generations.
That makes perfect sense.
And we can dig a bit deeper into this with Source A. This is a description from G.C. Barnes back in the 1850s, writing about the Gujjars of Kangra. He highlights that in the hills, the Gujjars are an exclusively pastoral tribe. They cultivate scarcely at all, he notes. Their wealth, unlike the Gaddis who primarily keep sheep and goats, consists mainly of buffaloes. These communities reside in the skirts of the forests, sustaining themselves almost entirely by selling milk, ghee, and other dairy products. This tells us about their specialization, you see. There's also a clear division of labor described. The men are responsible for grazing the cattle, often spending weeks out in the woods tending their herds. Meanwhile, the women play a critical role in marketing. They go to the markets every morning, carrying baskets on their heads filled with small earthen pots of milk, buttermilk, and ghee, each pot containing like a day's meal's worth. This reveals a highly organized internal economy.
Right, a whole system.
Exactly. And during the hot weather, Barnes notes, the Gujjars typically drive their herds to the upper ranges. This move is strategic. The buffaloes thrive in the rich grass that the rains bring forth, and simultaneously they benefit from the temperate climate up there. It offers immunity from the venomous flies that torment them down in the plains. Barnes also mentions Gujjar mandaps on the high mountains. These are essentially huts, typically found around 10,000 to 11,000 feet. They're constructed from ringal, that's a type of hill bamboo, and grass from the bugyal itself.
What were they used for?
These mandaps served as both living spaces and workplaces. Historically, Gujjars made ghee here to sell. However, in recent years, and this is a crucial point of adaptation, there's been a significant shift. They started transporting milk directly, using buses and trucks. This shows how even deeply traditional communities integrate modern infrastructure to optimize their livelihood. It's not static.
Mhm.
Interestingly, buffaloes, unlike sheep or goats, apparently cannot climb any higher than these specific mandaps.
That's fascinating detail. Okay, so from the high peaks and their intricate seasonal movements, let's descend now. Let's go down to the vast plateaus, plains, and deserts to understand how pastoralism adapted to entirely different geographical conditions. What kind of diverse strategies did these communities employ when snow wasn't the primary challenge, but maybe lack of water was?
Absolutely. A very different set of challenges, but equally complex adaptations. Not all pastoralists were confined to the mountains. Their presence was widespread across India's plateaus, plains, and deserts, showcasing incredible diversity. One important pastoral community from Maharashtra were the Dhangars. In the early 20th century, their population in this region was estimated at a significant 467,000, so quite numerous. And they fulfilled various roles. Most were shepherds, but others were skilled blanket weavers, and some specialized as buffalo herders. So, again, internal diversity within the community. The Dhangar shepherds had a distinct annual cycle, but this one was tied directly to the monsoon, not snow. During the monsoon season, they stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra. Now, this region is semi-arid. It's characterized by low rainfall and rather poor soil, largely covered with thorny scrub. Only dry crops like bajra could really be sown here. However, during the monsoon, this very tract transformed into a vast grazing ground, quite ideal for the Dhangar flocks.
So the monsoon was key there.
Absolutely. Then, by October, after they harvested their bajra, they began their westward migration. After about a month-long journey, maybe a bit more, they would reach the Konkan region. This is a flourishing agricultural tract, known for its high rainfall and rich soil. And here, the Dhangar shepherds were actually warmly welcomed by the Konkani peasants.
Why welcomed?
Well, this interaction was mutually beneficial. You see, after the Kharif harvest, that's the autumn crop, typically cut between September and October, the fields needed to be fertilized and prepared for the Rabi harvest, the spring crop harvested after March. The Dhangar flocks provided natural manure for the fields just by being there and grazing. They also fed on the stubble, the lower ends of grain stalks left after harvesting. In return, the Konkani peasants supplied the shepherds with rice, a grain that was scarce back on the dry plateau. Then, with the onset of the next monsoon, the Dhangars would leave the Konkan and the coastal areas with their flocks. They'd return to their settlements on the dry plateau as their sheep couldn't really tolerate the wet monsoon conditions of the Konkan.
That sounds like a truly symbiotic relationship. They were essentially contributing to agricultural productivity while ensuring their own herds were fed. A really clever system. Exactly. It's a perfect example of traditional ecological knowledge and economic interdependence. Really elegant, actually. Now, moving south into Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, the dry central plateau there, characterized mostly by stone and grass, was home to different groups of cattle, goat, and sheep herders, like the Gollas, Kurumas, and Kurubas. The Gollas specifically herded cattle. The Kurumas and Kurubas primarily reared sheep and goats, and were also known for selling woven blankets. So craft was integrated too.
Right.
Their livelihood was quite diverse. They often lived near the woods, cultivated small patches of land, engaged in various petty trades, and of course, meticulously cared for their herds. A key difference from their mountain counterparts was that their seasonal movements were dictated not by cold and snow, but by the clear alternation of the monsoon and dry seasons. During the dry season, they would move towards the coastal tracts, then they'd depart when the rains arrived. Interestingly, only buffaloes seemed to thrive in the swampy, wet conditions of the coastal areas during the monsoon months. Other herds had to be shifted back to the dry plateau during this time. So different animals, different tolerances, driving different movements.
Precisely. Adaptations upon adaptations. We also find the Banjaras, another well-known group of grazers. They were incredibly widespread, found in villages across Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, really all over. They were known for moving over long distances in search of good pasture land for their cattle. Their economic activity often involved selling plow cattle and other goods to villagers, exchanging them perhaps for grain and fodder. This made them vital arteries of trade and supply across vast regions, connecting distant markets and communities. They weren't just herders, they were traders too.
Connecting the dots across the landscape.
Exactly. And let's illustrate this further with source B. This is an early 19th century account by Buchanan, who visited the Gollas during his travels through Mysore. He observed that their families lived in small villages, often near the skirts of the woods. Here, they cultivated small patches of land and kept some of their cattle, selling dairy produce in nearby towns. Buchanan noted that their families were remarkably numerous, with 7 to 8 young men being common in each household.
Wow.
He described a clear division of labor, stating, and I quote loosely here, that 2 or 3 of these attend the flocks in the woods, while the remainder cultivate their fields and supply the towns with firewood and with straw for thatch. This highlights their multifaceted approach to livelihood and resource management. They were integrating cultivation, herding, and trade. It also indicates how pastoral groups often choose to live on the edges of forests, using the varied resources of both open pastures and wooded areas.
Makes sense. Diversification.
Absolutely. And finally, let's consider the deserts of Rajasthan. Here lived the Raikas. Now, the rainfall in the Thar region is meager, it's uncertain, leading to highly fluctuating harvests on any cultivated land. Over vast stretches, no crops could be grown consistently. Consequently, the Raikas ingeniously combined cultivation with pastoralism. During the monsoons, the Raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner stayed in their home villages, where pasture was, well, temporarily available. However, by October, when these grazing grounds became dry and exhausted, they would move out. They'd search for new pasture and water, returning again only during the next monsoon.
So a different rhythm again, dictated by desert conditions.
Precisely. And within the Raika community, there were specialized groups. One group, known as the Maru Raikas Maru, meaning desert, specifically herded camels. Another group reared sheep and goats. Their temporary settlements, when they were out moving, are known as a hundi. And the significance of their camel fairs, like the famous ones at Balotra and Pushkar, cannot be overstated. These weren't just markets for selling and buying camels, or even horses from Gujarat, which also came there. They were vibrant platforms for the Maru Raikas to display their expertise in training their camels. It demonstrated their deep connection to their animals and their specialized craft.
It's truly incredible to see how these diverse communities, whether in the mountains, plateaus, or deserts, managed to thrive by understanding and adapting so intricately to their specific environments. So what's the core takeaway about this sustainability and maybe the complexity of their traditional way of life before things changed?
So, synthesizing all this, you can clearly see that the life of these pastoral groups was sustained by a really complex and careful consideration of a whole host of factors. They had to skillfully judge how long their herds could stay in one area without depleting the resources, right? They needed an intimate knowledge of the land, knowing precisely where they could find water and fresh pasture at different times of the year. Crucially, they had to meticulously calculate the timing of their movements, ensuring they could move through different territories, often territories used by farmers without conflict. Furthermore, establishing those mutually beneficial relationships with farmers along their routes was vital. This allowed their herds to graze in harvested fields, providing essential manure for the soil in return for fodder. Their livelihood was truly multifaceted. It combined a range of different activities, cultivation, trade, herding, to ensure their survival and prosperity. And for you studying for exams, this section provides crucial examples of adaptation to diverse Indian terrains and livelihood strategies. It's highly valuable for case studies and analytical questions, demonstrating how a livelihood can be built on nuanced environmental understanding and social negotiation.
Having understood that intricate balance of traditional pastoral life, it's now time to examine how this delicate system faced, well, unprecedented challenges with the advent of colonial rule. What fundamental changes reshaped their existence? How did these policies fundamentally alter their age-old practices?
Right, this is where the story takes a dramatic and often tragic turn. The arrival of colonial rule fundamentally altered the lives of pastoralists in India. The core impact was profound, really. Their traditional grazing grounds shrank significantly. Their movements became heavily regulated, controlled. The revenue demands placed upon them increased sharply. Furthermore, their agricultural stock, their animal wealth declined, and their traditional trades and crafts were also adversely affected. It was a complete paradigm shift, as you said, moving from an adaptable, fluid system rooted in ecological wisdom to one of rigid control and, frankly, exploitation.
That sounds like a complete upheaval. Can you break down the specific policies? What were the tools the colonial state used to bring about such drastic changes?
Absolutely. Let's break down the specific mechanisms of colonial control that led to these drastic changes. It wasn't just one thing. It was a combination of policies. First, we have what were called the wasteland rules. Now, imagine waking up one day to find your family's ancestral grazing lands, lands used for generations, suddenly declared waste by a new foreign power and then given away to strangers to cultivate. That's the brutal reality many pastoralists faced.
Just declared waste. Why?
The colonial government's primary motivation for these rules was economic, pure and simple. They wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. Why? Because land revenue was one of the main sources of their finance. By expanding cultivation, they could significantly increase their revenue collection. At the same time, they could produce more cash crops, things like jute, cotton, wheat, which were in high demand back in England for their burgeoning industries. To colonial officials, any uncultivated land was seen as unproductive. It produced neither revenue nor agricultural goods, hence it was labeled wasteland that needed to be brought under cultivation.
A very narrow perspective.
Extremely narrow.
Yeah.
So, from the mid-19th century onwards, these wasteland rules were enacted across various parts of the country. Under these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over by the state and then given, often on concessional terms, to select individuals. These individuals were actively encouraged to settle and cultivate these lands. Some were even made headmen of new villages created in these cleared areas. The grave consequence, of course, was that in most areas, the lands taken over were actually traditional grazing tracts. These were lands regularly used by pastoralists for generations. So the expansion of cultivation inevitably meant a direct decline of essential pastures, creating a severe and escalating problem for the pastoral communities. Their resource base was literally shrinking under their feet.
And then there were the forests.
Exactly. Second, by the mid-19th century, various forest acts were also enacted in different provinces. These acts aimed to control and manage forests, but primarily for timber production needed by the colonial state, particularly for railways and shipbuilding. Through these legislations, some forests, specifically those that produced commercially valuable timber like deodar or sal, were declared reserved. This meant no pastoralist was allowed any access to these critical forest areas for grazing. Period.
Completely off limits.
Completely. Other forests were classified as protected. Now, while some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were nominally granted in these protected forests, their movements were still severely restricted. The underlying colonial rationale was a strong and largely incorrect belief that grazing by animals destroyed saplings and young shoots of trees germinating on the forest floor. They believed that the herds trampled over these young plants and munched away the shoots, thereby preventing new trees from growing and hindering timber production.
So their very way of life, which we just discussed as being potentially sustainable, was now officially framed as destructive.
Precisely. It's a complete inversion. These forest acts drastically changed the lives of pastoralists. They were now prevented from entering many forests that had historically provided valuable forage for their cattle, especially during lean seasons. And even in the areas where they were allowed entry, their movements became heavily regulated. They needed a specific permit for entry. The timing of their entry and departure was strictly specified. Moreover, the number of days they could spend in the forest was severely limited.
So no flexibility based on actual conditions.
None whatsoever. This meant pastoralists could no longer remain in an area even if there was ample forage available, even if the grass was succulent, or if the undergrowth in the forest was rich. They were forced to move simply because the Forest Department permits, which now governed their lives, specified strict periods during which they could legally be within a forest. If they overstayed, they were liable to face hefty fines. And we have Source C, an observation by H.S. Gibson, who was the Deputy Conservator of Forests in Darjeeling back in 1913. He clearly illustrates this rigid colonial forester's perspective. He wrote that, quote, "Forest which is used for grazing cannot be used for any other purpose and is unable to yield timber and fuel, which are the main legitimate forest produce." It shows a mindset that completely disregarded the pastoralists' sustainable use of forest resources, viewing everything only through the lens of timber extraction.
It sounds incredibly restrictive. Were there other controls?
Oh, yes. Third, British officials harbored this deep suspicion towards nomadic people in general. They just didn't trust mobile craftsmen and traders who moved around selling their goods, and they certainly distrusted pastoralists who changed their places of residence every season, moving in search of good pastures. The colonial government desired, fundamentally, to rule over a settled population. Their ideal was for rural people to live in villages, in fixed places, with fixed rights on particular fields. Such a population, in their view, was far easier to identify, control, and, crucially, tax.
Easier to manage.
Exactly. Those who were settled were conveniently seen as peaceable and law-abiding citizens, whereas those who were nomadic were, quite unjustly, considered to be criminal or potentially criminal. In 1871, this suspicion materialized into a truly draconian law. The colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities, including craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists, were arbitrarily classified as criminal tribes.
Classified as criminal just for their lifestyle.
Essentially, yes. They were explicitly stated to be criminal by nature and birth. Can you imagine? Once this act came into force, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements. They were not allowed to move out without a permit, and the village police maintained a continuous, oppressive watch on them. You can just imagine the severe psychological and social impact this had. It stripped them of their freedom, their dignity. This is a significant point for analytical questions in your exams when discussing the broader, often hidden implications of colonial control.
That's appalling. And taxation, too.
Of course. Fourth, to further expand its revenue income, the colonial government relentlessly looked for every possible source of taxation. They taxed land, canal water, salt, trade goods, and even directly on animals. Pastoralists were compelled to pay a tax on every single animal they grazed on the pastures. In most pastoral tracts of India, this grazing tax was introduced in the mid-19th century. The tax per head of cattle escalated rapidly over time, and the system of collection became increasingly efficient and often highly exploitative. In the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect this tax was often auctioned out to private contractors.
Contractors? How did that work?
Well, these contractors, driven purely by profit, would try to extract as high a tax as they possibly could from the pastoralists. They needed to recover the money they had paid to the state for the contract and then maximize their own earnings within the year. It often led to harassment and extortion. By the 1880s, the government shifted tactics and started collecting these taxes directly from the pastoralists themselves. Each herder was given a pass. To enter a grazing tract, a cattle herder had to show this pass and pay the tax. The number of cattle heads they possessed and the amount of tax they paid was meticulously entered on this pass. It created a highly controlled and financially burdensome system, another layer of restriction and cost.
So these various colonial measures, the land rules, the forest acts, the criminalization, the taxes collectively sound like a systematic dismantling of their traditional way of life. What were the overall consequences for the pastoral communities and, their livestock?
You're right. It was a systematic attack. Whether always intended that way or not, that was the effect. These various measures collectively led to a serious, chronic shortage of pastures. That's the first major consequence. When grazing lands were taken over and converted into cultivated fields under the wasteland rules, the available area for pasture land simply declined dramatically in some areas. Similarly, the reservation of forests through the Forest Acts meant that shepherds and cattle herders could no longer freely pasture their cattle in areas that had traditionally sustained them, especially during critical periods.
And the impact on the remaining pastures.
Exactly. As pasture lands disappeared under the plow or were closed off by forest laws, the existing animal stock was forced to feed on whatever limited grazing land remained. This inevitably led to continuous, intensive grazing of these severely reduced pastures. Now remember, traditionally, nomadic pastoralists would graze their animals in one area for a limited time and then move on. These essential pastoral movements allowed sufficient time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. It prevented degradation. However, when severe restrictions were imposed on their movements, the remaining grazing lands came to be continuously used year after year without rest. This led to a significant deterioration in the quality of these pastures. They just couldn't recover.
Which must have affected the animals.
Absolutely. This, in turn, created a further severe shortage of forage for the animals and a general deterioration of the animal stock itself. Underfed cattle, weakened by lack of proper nourishment, died in alarmingly large numbers during periods of scarcity and famine. What were once manageable periods of hardship, which they could navigate through movement, turned into devastating crises under the colonial system. And we have clear evidence for this in Source D. This is the report of the Royal Commission on Agriculture in India, published in 1928. It starkly highlighted these consequences. It reported, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, the extent of the area available for grazing has gone down tremendously because of increasing population, extension of irrigation facilities, acquiring the pastures for government purposes, like defense, industries, and experimental farms.
So multiple pressures reducing grazing land.
Multiple pressures. The report concluded with the dire observation that now breeders find it difficult to raise large herds. Thus, their earnings have gone down, the quality of their livestock has deteriorated, dietary standards have fallen, and indebtedness has increased. This paints a vivid, heartbreaking picture of the comprehensive economic and social hardship faced by pastoralists, demonstrating a complete breakdown of their traditional systems under colonial pressure.
It's clear these profound changes didn't go unchallenged, nor did they lead to the complete disappearance of pastoral life, remarkably. How did Indian pastoralists, facing such immense pressures, manage to adapt and survive in this new, very constrained world? What ingenious strategies did they devise?
That's right. Despite the immense pressures, pastoralists demonstrated incredible resilience and adaptability. They weren't just passive victims. They reacted to these changes in a variety of strategic ways. For instance, some pastoralists chose, perhaps reluctantly, to reduce the number of cattle in their herds. This was a direct response to the fact that there simply wasn't enough pasture left to feed large numbers sustainably anymore. Others actively discovered and utilized new pastures when their traditional movement to old grazing grounds became impossible or heavily restricted by permits or boundaries.
Can you give an example of finding new pastures?
Yes, a really poignant example of this strategic adjustment occurred after 1947, after partition. The camel and sheep herding Raikas, who, as we discussed, had historically moved into Sindh, which became part of Pakistan, and grazed their camels on the banks of the Indus River, suddenly found their movement stopped. The new political boundary between India and Pakistan cut off their traditional route. This forced them to find new places. And in recent years, many Raikas have adapted quite successfully by migrating northwards into Haryana. There, their sheep can graze on agricultural fields after the harvests are cut. This creates a new kind of mutually beneficial relationship, similar to the Dhangars in Konkan. The animals provide much-needed manure for the fields while getting their own nourishment from the stubble.
Adapting to geopolitical change as well.
Exactly. But colonial policies also led to a significant socioeconomic divergence within pastoral communities. It wasn't a uniform impact. On one hand, some richer pastoralists, those who perhaps had larger herds initially or other resources, began buying land and settling down. They gradually gave up their nomadic life. Some of these individuals transformed into settled peasants, cultivating land full-time. Others ventured into more expensive trading activities, diversifying their income streams away from pure pastoralism. This was a path to relative prosperity and stability for some.
And the others? The poor ones?
Well, on the other hand, many poor pastoralists, lacking such resources or reserves, found themselves in increasingly desperate situations. They were often forced to borrow money from moneylenders just to survive, especially during droughts or disease outbreaks among their animals. Tragically, at times, they lost their cattle and sheep due to inability to repay debts or sustain losses during famines. Consequently, many became laborers. They ended up working on fields in rural areas or taking up various odd jobs in small towns, things like charcoal burning or manual labor in road and building construction. Their traditional skills became less viable, forcing them into new, often much more precarious livelihoods.
So some managed to adapt and even thrive in new ways, while others were really pushed to the margins. What does this tell us about the long-term viability of their way of life, even with these pressures?
It tells us that despite these enormous challenges and the resulting diversification and social stratification, pastoralists not only continue to survive, but remarkably, in many regions, their numbers have actually expanded over recent decades. This is a real testament to their enduring resilience. When pasture lands in one place were closed to them, they actively changed the direction of their movement. They reduced the size of their herds to match available resources. They combined pastoral activity with other forms of income. They fundamentally adapted to the changes in the modern world. And it's important to recognize that their way of life is far from obsolete, even today. Many ecologists and economists are increasingly coming to believe that in dry regions and in the mountains, pastoralism is still ecologically the most viable form of life. It offers a sustainable alternative to conventional agriculture in challenging environments where settled farming might not be feasible or even desirable. And for your exams, the section on adaptation and resilience is critical. It helps you understand societal responses to historical change, which is often a key theme in essay and analytical questions. It demonstrates the enduring human spirit, that capacity to adapt in the face of really significant adversity.
That's a powerful point. And this story of adaptation and struggle is clearly not unique to India, is it? Moving across continents, we discover striking similar patterns of impact and resilience among pastoral communities in Africa. What can we learn from their experiences, perhaps focusing on a prominent group like the Maasai?
Indeed, the story resonates very deeply across continents. Africa is home to over half of the world's pastoral population. Even today, estimates suggest over 22 million Africans depend on some form of pastoral activity for their livelihood. This vast population includes major communities such as the Bedouins, Berbers, the Maasai, whom you mentioned, Somali, Boran, Turkana, many diverse groups. Most of these communities now reside in semi-arid grasslands or arid deserts regions where rain-fed agriculture is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to sustain reliably.
And their livelihoods are similar.
Broadly similar, yes. Their livelihoods revolve around raising various animals like cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkeys. From these animals, they sell milk, meat, animal skins, and wool. Some also supplement their income through trade and transport, while others combine pastoral activity with agriculture where possible. Still others resort to a variety of odd jobs to bolster their often meager and uncertain earnings from pastoralism alone. And the overarching thesis, much like in India, is that the lives of African pastoralists have also changed dramatically, fundamentally, during both the colonial and post-colonial periods. The pressures were very similar.
Okay. So among these diverse groups, the Maasai offer a particularly compelling case study, you said. Let's delve into that. How did colonial policy specifically reshape their ancient way of life in East Africa?
All right, the Maasai are a very well-documented example. They are primarily cattle herders living mainly in East Africa. There are approximately 300,000 in southern Kenya and perhaps another 150,000 in Tanzania. One of the most significant problems they faced under colonialism was the continuous, relentless loss of their grazing lands. Before colonial times, Maaseland, their traditional territory, stretched over a truly vast area extending from northern Kenya all the way down to the steppes of northern Tanzania. It was huge.
But colonialism changed that.
Drastically. In the late 19th century, as European imperial powers engaged in the so-called scramble for Africa, carving up the continent for territorial positions, they sliced right through the region. In 1885, Maaseland was quite literally cut in half by an artificial international boundary established between what became British Kenya and German Tanganyika, which later became Tanzania. This was the first major blow, a division of their ancestral lands by an arbitrary line drawn on a map in Europe.
Just split in two.
Just like that. Subsequently, the best and most fertile grazing lands within these newly defined colonies were gradually taken over for white settlement. European settlers wanted the prime land. As a result, the Maasai were forcibly pushed into a much smaller, generally more arid zone located in South Kenya and North Tanzania. They effectively lost something like 60% of their pre-colonial lands. They were confined to an area with much more uncertain rainfall and generally poorer pastures.
And was cultivation also encouraged, like in India?
Yes, exactly the same policy. From the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa also actively encouraged local peasant communities, non-Maasai groups, to expand cultivation. As agriculture expanded, more and more pasture lands traditionally used by the Maasai for grazing were converted into cultivated fields. And this had a profound impact on power dynamics too. In pre-colonial times, the Maasai pastoralists had often economically and politically dominated their agricultural neighbors. But by the end of colonial rule, this situation was completely inverted. Their traditional influence waned significantly as agricultural settlements expanded and gained state support. The loss of land, loss of power, anything else. Yes. Adding to this loss, large areas of traditional Maasai grazing land were also transformed into highly exclusive game reserves. You might know some famous names, the Masai Mara and Samburu National Park in Kenya, and the renowned Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Pastoralists, including the Maasai, were strictly disallowed from entering these reserves. They can neither hunt animals for food nor graze their herds in these areas, even though these were often prime grazing lands. Very often, these reserves were established precisely in areas that had traditionally served as regular and vital grazing grounds for Maasai herds, particularly during dry seasons.
So their crucial dry season refuge areas were taken.
Exactly. The Serengeti National Park, for instance, was created over a massive 14,760 square kilometers of prime Maasai grazing land. This directly impacted their access to crucial resources needed for survival, especially when conditions were tough elsewhere. And we have Source E, which really illustrates the human impact of these land policies, those from Namibia, not Maasai land directly. The Kaukoland herders there in southwest Africa traditionally moved between Kaukoland and nearby Ovambo land. They traded skins, meat, other products. But all of this was stopped by the new territorial boundaries imposed by colonialism. In 1949, they made this incredible, poignant statement. They said, "We have difficulty. We cry. We are imprisoned. We do not know why we are locked up. We are in jail. We have no place to live. We cannot get meat from the south. Our sleeping skins cannot be sent out. Ovamba land is closed for us. The borders are closed. The borders press us heavily. We cannot live."
Wow, imprisoned. That's powerful.
Isn't it? It highlights that feeling of being literally imprisoned by these arbitrary lines and restrictions on their fundamental way of life. It really paints a picture of desperation and confusion. So the devastating consequence of all these measures for the Maasai and others was the loss of their finest grazing lands and critical water resources. This created immense and unsustainable pressure on the already small area of land that they were confined within. Continuous grazing within such a limited area inevitably led to a severe deterioration in the quality of the pastures. Fodder, the essential food for their cattle, was constantly in short supply. Feeding their herds became a persistent and growing problem, jeopardizing their entire livelihood.
That loss of land is staggering. And it was profoundly compounded, you mentioned, by severe restrictions on movement itself, which is so fundamental to pastoral survival. How did these closed borders and mobility restrictions impact their resilience? How did a life of inherent mobility transform into one of forced confinement?
Yes, the ability to move freely was, and still is, the absolute cornerstone of pastoral survival, especially in arid and semi-arid environments. In the 19th century, African pastoralists, including the Maasai, could move over vast areas in search of pastures. It was normal. When the pastures in one place became exhausted, they simply moved to a different area to graze their cattle, a natural and sustainable rotation. However, from the late 19th century onwards, the colonial governments began imposing various severe restrictions on their mobility. It wasn't just about land alienation, it was about controlling movement itself. Like the Maasai, other pastoral groups were also forced to live within the confines of special reserves. The physical boundaries of these reserves became the absolute limits within which they could now legally move.
So they couldn't leave the reserves.
Not without permission, no. They were no longer allowed to move out with their livestock without acquiring special permits. And obtaining these permits was notoriously difficult. It often led to trouble and harassment from colonial authorities who viewed them with suspicion. Those found guilty of disobeying these rigid rules were subjected to severe punishment, like fines or confiscation of livestock. Furthermore, pastoralists were explicitly not allowed to enter markets located in white areas in many regions, nor were they permitted to participate in any form of trade in those zones. White settlers and European colonists generally held this deeply prejudiced view of pastoralists, often seeing them as dangerous and savage people with whom all contact had to be minimized, controlled.
So economic isolation, too.
Yes, though cutting off all links was never entirely possible. White colonists still needed black labor for mining, road construction, building towns, etc. But these restrictions severely impacted both their pastoral activities and their vital trading networks. Although trade was never entirely stopped, it was heavily restricted, forcing pastoralists into a highly disadvantageous position. The new territorial boundaries and these mobility restrictions imposed on them fundamentally and suddenly changed the lives of pastoralists. It adversely affected their entire economic and social fabric. And Source F, which is a magistrate's instruction from 1937 in Southwest Africa, clearly demonstrates this intent. It states, quite chillingly, "Passes into the territory should not be given to these natives unless exceptional circumstances necessitate their entering. The object of the above proclamation is to restrict the number of natives entering the territory and to keep a check on them, and ordinary visiting passes should therefore never be issued to them."
Wow, explicit control.
Absolutely explicit. It highlights the deliberate colonial strategy to control and restrict the African population, including pastoralists, treating them essentially as a threat to be managed and contained.
Such profound constraints, loss of land, restricted movement, must have had a devastating impact, especially during the inevitable periods of environmental hardship, like droughts. Let's examine that. How did droughts, once manageable through their traditional nomadic practices, now become catastrophic crises for the Maasai?
Yes, the impact of drought is absolutely critical for understanding the vulnerability created by colonial policies. Traditionally, pastoralists lived with drought. When rains failed and pastures dried up, cattle were likely to starve unless they could be moved to areas where forage was still available, maybe areas that received patchy rainfall or had different types of vegetation. This is precisely why pastoralists are nomadic. Their constant movement from place to place is their primary coping mechanism for dealing with environmental uncertainty, especially drought. This nomadism allowed them to survive bad times and avoid widespread crises.
But colonialism took that away.
Exactly. From the colonial period onwards, the Maasai were bound down to fixed areas, they were confined within their reserves, and absolutely prohibited from moving in search of pastures outside those boundaries. They were cut off from their best grazing lands, often the ones that were more resilient during drought, and forced to live within semi-arid tracts that were naturally prone to frequent and severe droughts anyway.
So they were trapped in the worst areas during the worst times.
Essentially, yes.
Hmm.
The consequences were devastating. Since they could no longer shift their cattle to places where pastures were available, enormous numbers of Maasai cattle died from starvation and disease during these drought years. They simply had nowhere to go. For instance, an inquiry conducted in 1930 revealed that the Maasai in Kenya possessed approximately 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, and 171,000 donkeys, a huge number of animals. Yet in just two severe drought years, 1933 and 1934, over half of the cattle in the Maasai Reserve perished.
Half their cattle in 2 years.
It's a staggering loss. And as the overall area of grazing lands continued to shrink due to ongoing colonial policies like cultivation, expansion, and game reserves, the adverse effects of droughts became far more intense and far more frequent. The recurring bad years led to a steady and alarming decline in the animal stock of the pastoralists, pushing many to the brink of destitution and fundamentally altering their entire economy and way of life. Drought became a catastrophe, not just a hardship.
Yet within this adversity, you mentioned earlier that not all Maasai experienced the same fate. Colonial policies subtly and sometimes overtly reshaped their social fabric, creating new divisions and altering traditional hierarchies. How did their society transform under this new colonial administration? Who benefited, if anyone, and who lost out the most?
That's a crucial observation, yes. In Masailand, as was the case elsewhere in Africa, not all pastoralists were equally affected by the changes brought about by the colonial period. There were winners and losers, so to speak, even within the community. To understand this, we need to look at pre-colonial Maasai society. It had a distinct social structure, broadly divided into two primary categories: the elders and the warriors. The elders formed the ruling group. They met in periodic councils to decide on community affairs and settle disputes. They held the political authority. The warriors, comprised mainly of younger men, were primarily responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and significantly organized cattle raids.
Cattle raids were important.
Very important. Raiding was a significant activity in a society where cattle represented wealth, status, and power. It was through these raids that the power of different pastoral groups was often asserted. And for young men, participating in raids was how they gained recognition as members of the warrior class, proving their manliness and contributing to the community's wealth. However, it's important to note that even these powerful warriors were ultimately subject to the authority of the elders.
Okay, so elders and warriors. How did the British change this?
The British administration, primarily to exert control over the Maasai, introduced a series of measures that had really important implications for this traditional social structure. First, they began by appointing chiefs for different subgroups of Maasai. These appointed chiefs were then made responsible for the affairs of their respective tribes, effectively bypassing or co-opting traditional authority structures. Simultaneously, the British imposed various restrictions on traditional raiding and warfare. They wanted peace and order on their terms. The direct consequence of these actions was that the traditional authority of both the elders and the warriors was significantly undermined and adversely affected. The age-old ways of asserting power, gaining status, and managing community affairs were being eroded by external interference.
And did this create new power structures?
Yes, absolutely. This interference also led to the emergence of new elites within Maasai society. The chiefs appointed by the colonial government often managed to accumulate considerable wealth over time. They received a regular income or other benefits from the colonial state, which enabled them to purchase more animals, goods, and even land something less common traditionally. They could also lend money to their poorer neighbors who desperately needed cash, often to pay the newly imposed colonial taxes. Many of these appointed chiefs began to live in towns, at least partially, and became involved in trade, diversifying their economic activities beyond pure pastoralism.
So they had advantages others didn't?
Precisely. While they might live in towns, their wives and children often stayed back in the villages to look after the animals, maintaining a connection to their pastoral roots, but with added economic security. Crucially, these chiefs were much better equipped to survive the devastations of war, which was now suppressed but conflicts still occurred, and especially drought. They had both pastoral and non-pastoral income streams. This allowed them to buy animals when their own stock was depleted during a crisis, providing a buffer that most ordinary pastoralists simply lacked.
And what about the poor pastoralists in this new system?
Well, in stark contrast, the life history of the poor pastoralists, those who depended solely on their livestock, was very different and often much harder. Most often, they simply did not possess the resources or the diverse income streams to tide them over bad times, like drought or disease outbreaks. In periods of war and famine, they frequently lost nearly everything they owned. With their traditional livelihoods undermined and their resilience reduced, many were forced to seek work in the growing towns. Some eke out a living as charcoal burners. Others performed various odd jobs, just trying to get by. Only the lucky few could secure more regular work in road or building construction. It highlights the increasing precariousness of their existence and the drastic change in their social standing compared to the newly emerging elite.
So it sounds like colonialism created deeper divisions within Maasai society.
Exactly. The social changes in Maasai society effectively occurred at two significant levels. First, the traditional difference based on age, specifically the dynamic between the elders and the warriors, was disturbed, although it didn't completely break down. Second, and perhaps more significantly for the long term, a distinct new distinction developed between the wealthy and the poor pastoralists. It created a kind of class-like division based more on accumulated wealth and connection to the colonial state that hadn't existed in quite the same way before colonial intervention. And again, for your exams, this detailed breakdown of social stratification under colonial rule is absolutely crucial. It helps you understand the complex socioeconomic impacts of colonialism and their long-term consequences, which is a common theme in advanced competitive exams focusing on history and sociology.
That's a really important dimension to consider. Okay, let's try and bring this all together now.
Right. So as we've explored across both India and Africa, it becomes strikingly clear that pastoral communities in different parts of the world have been profoundly affected, often in very similar ways, by the changes brought about in the modern era, particularly under colonialism. New laws, the imposition of artificial borders, these things significantly altered their traditional patterns of movement. With increasing restrictions on their mobility, pastoralists found it immensely difficult, sometimes impossible, to move in search of fresh pastures as they always had.
And the land itself suffered.
Yes. As pasture lands disappeared due to agriculture or forest reservation, grazing became a critical problem. The pastures that did remain deteriorated rapidly through continuous overgrazing because the animals were concentrated in smaller areas. Consequently, times of drought, which they once navigated through strategic nomadism, became devastating crises, leading to massive cattle deaths and immense hardship.
But they didn't just disappear.
No, absolutely not. Yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, pastoralists have consistently demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability to new times. They changed the paths of their annual movements when old ones were blocked. They reduced their cattle numbers to align with available resources. They actively pressed for rights to enter new areas. They exerted political pressure on governments colonial and post-colonial for relief, subsidies, and other forms of support. And increasingly today, they also demand a right in the management of crucial resources like forests and water, arguing their traditional knowledge is vital.
So they are not just a relic of the past.
Not at all. The powerful assertion here is that pastoralists are not relics of the past. They are not people who have no place in the modern world. In fact, environmentalists and economists have increasingly come to recognize that pastoral nomadism is a form of life that is perfectly suited, both ecologically and economically, to many hilly and dry regions across the globe. It's often a more sustainable way of using marginal lands than trying to impose unsuitable forms of settled agriculture.
That's a crucial final point. As we've explored, the journey of pastoralists is truly one of constant adaptation and this incredibly deep connection to the land. What really stands out to you about their innovative ways of survival, perhaps something for our listeners to ponder? And maybe, how might their historical struggle inform our own understanding of sustainable livelihoods in today's rapidly changing world? It definitely makes you think about our own reliance on static systems, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Their ability to read the environment, to work with it rather than against it, holds lessons for all of us.
We really hope this deep dive has provided you with a clear and comprehensive understanding of pastoral societies, their rich history, and the significant challenges they've faced and continue to face. For more such content and exam-ready insights, make sure to follow us and subscribe to the deep dive. In this deep dive, we covered the following topics: nomadic pastoralists in India, life on the move, including mountain communities like the Gujjar Bakarwals and Gaddis, and plains, plateaus, and desert communities like the Dhangars, Gollas, Kurumas, Kurubas, Banjaras, and Raikas. The impact of colonial rule on Indian pastoralists, exploring the wasteland rules, the Forest Acts, the Criminal Tribes Act, and the Grazing Tax. We looked at pastoralists' adaptations and responses in India to these colonial changes. Then we moved to pastoralism in Africa, focusing on the Maasai case study, detailing their loss of grazing lands and the severe restrictions on their mobility. We also examined the devastating impact of droughts on African pastoralists once their movement was restricted. And finally, the social transformation and unequal effects within pastoral communities, particularly the Maasai under colonial rule.